Get ready for a chilling night. Immerse yourself in horror stories that will accompany you until you sleep. If these dark narratives help you delve into the world of dreams, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more eerily peaceful nights. The afternoon heat was relentless as I maneuvered the rig along the dusty road, hauling a load of rocklight from near Trona, California, to a plant near Temecula. It was July 1956, and with no air conditioning in the Peterbilt, the oppressive heat was almost unbearable. The air was dry, and the 20-mile corduroy dirt road to the quarry site had been an ordeal. But now, back on the paved road heading south toward Red Mountain, I hoped for a smoother ride. The truck, slightly overloaded, was holding steady at 50 miles per hour. Out of nowhere, something darted across the road, forcing me to slam on the brakes. A man appeared almost in the center of the road, waving his arms frantically. I brought the rig to a halt just short of him. His disheveled appearance was striking wild, sun-bleached hair blown about by the hot desert wind, no shirt, dirty khaki pants, and bare feet that looked like old dust-covered shoes. His skin was dangerously sunburned, and he seemed to be in a state of panic. He climbed up onto the running board of the truck, his eyes wide with an unsettling intensity. Sweat and dirt coated his blistered face, and his cracked lips struggled to form words. I rolled down the window and asked, "What's the matter? You need help? Can I take you somewhere? You look like you need medical assistance." The man gasped for breath, struggling to speak. No, he finally blurted out. His distress was palpable. "Why did you stop me?" I pressed further, trying to understand what was going on. He pointed past the hood of the rig, gesturing vaguely northwest. "There are 2 dead rabbits out there. There are 2 of them. They're dead. Rabbits!" he shouted. His insistence on the rabbits, combined with his frantic demeanor, left me bewildered. I offered him some water, hoping to calm him down, but he refused, insisting instead on heading off into the desert scrub. I watched as he crossed in front of the rig and disappeared down a faint trail. As I continued south toward 395, my mind was troubled. I wrestled with conflicting thoughts whether I should have forced him to get help or just moved on. Eventually, I delivered the load to its destination near Temecula. To do something, I called the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office and reported the incident, giving them all the details I could. Back then, there were no cell phones or GPS devices, and I hoped someone would find him. Years later, the image of that sweaty, wild-eyed man still haunted me. His frantic declaration about the 2 dead rabbits echoed in my mind, especially when I heard the theme to the Twilight Zone. I never discovered what really happened in that desert, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to that encounter than just 2 dead rabbits. After the encounter in the desert, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling as I continued the drive to Temecula. The air inside the cab felt stifling, and the road stretched endlessly before me. The hot afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into the horizon. The monotonous hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the pavement did little to soothe my frayed nerves. As I drove, my mind kept replaying the man's frantic face and his bizarre claim about the dead rabbits. I tried to focus on the road, but my thoughts kept wandering back to the desert and the faint trail the man had disappeared down. What could have driven him to such a state? Was there really something out there, or was it a result of the heat and exhaustion? The emptiness of the desert had been oppressive, but it wasn't until I started to think about it more deeply that I felt a creeping sense of dread. The sun was setting now, and the fading light cast eerie shadows across the landscape. The once familiar scenery seemed to take on a new, unsettling quality in the twilight. The vast expanse of the desert, with its sparse vegetation and scattered rocks, now felt menacing. When I finally arrived at the plant near Temecula, I was grateful for the break. The night had fallen, and the temperature had dropped slightly, making the air feel cooler. But even as I unloaded the rocklight, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The man's desperate gaze and his odd message had left a mark on me that I couldn't ignore. That night, as I lay in the small, unremarkable motel room I de-booked, I found it difficult to relax. The walls seemed to close in, and the darkness outside felt oppressive. Every creak of the building and every gust of wind sounded more ominous than usual. I tried to distract myself with the radio, but even the soothing tones of the announcer couldn't fully dispel the unsettling thoughts that plagued me. The idea of those two dead rabbits haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. The next morning, I set off early, eager to leave behind the discomfort of the motel and the haunting memory of the previous day. The sky was clear, but the desert still held its harsh, relentless heat. The drive back to Trona was uneventful at first, but as I neared the area where I had encountered the distressed man, a sense of unease began to creep over me. The route back took me through the same desolate stretches of road and scrubby desert. As I drove, I couldn't help but keep an eye out for any signs of the man or the strange scene he had described. The landscape was eerily quiet, with only the distant hum of the truck and the occasional chirp of a bird breaking the silence. The desert seemed even more vast and empty than before. Passing the spot where I had seen the man, I noticed that nothing had changed. There were no signs of the two dead rabbits he had spoken of, just the same barren stretch of sand and rocks. It struck me as odd that such a significant detail could be completely absent. I had half expected to see something, even if only a remnant of the bizarre scene he described. As I continued driving, I recalled the sound of the man's voice, his desperate, almost frantic tone as he yelled about the rabbits. It was as if his words had been imprinted in my mind, repeating over and over. I tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the road and the task at hand, but the nagging curiosity about what had really happened in that remote stretch of desert wouldn't leave me. By the time I reached Trona and finished unloading, the sun was setting once again. The familiar heat of the day had turned into the cool, unsettling chill of night. I felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension as I prepared to head home. The encounter with the man had left an indelible mark on my memory, and the mystery of the two dead rabbits lingered in the back of my mind, unresolved and haunting. The drive home from Trona was long and uneventful, yet the encounter from the previous day stayed with me like a shadow. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, the man's frantic eyes, his wild claims, and the desolate stretch of desert where he had disappeared. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed as though something significant had happened out there, even if I couldn't quite grasp what it was. Arriving back home late at night, the familiar surroundings offered little comfort. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant sounds of the city. I lay in bed, trying to relax, but sleep eluded me. The man's image haunted my thoughts, and the eerie silence of the desert seemed to echo in the quiet of my bedroom. The next morning, I found myself unusually restless. I decided to take a drive back to the desert, not with the intention of investigating, but to see if anything had changed since my last visit. As I approached the area, the landscape looked unchanged. The harsh reality of the desert was still there, unyielding and indifferent. The heat and the emptiness of the environment seemed to swallow up any sense of comfort or familiarity. Despite the unchanging scenery, the memory of the encounter lingered, affecting me more deeply than I had anticipated. The man's desperate plea about the dead rabbits had left a mark on me, and the unanswered questions gnawed at my sense of closure. As I drove through the arid landscape, I couldn't help but feel that something profound had occurred, even if I would never fully understand it. Returning home once more, the feeling of unease remained. The mystery of the two dead rabbits became a part of my personal folklore, a haunting reminder of that sweltering July day in the desert. The story of the frantic man and his strange warning about the rabbits was a constant companion, an unsettling echo of the desert that refused to fade from my memory. It was a reminder that some experiences, no matter how elusive, leave a lasting imprint on our lives. And so, the desert and its enigmatic encounter remained with me, a story that had begun as a strange episode on a hot summer day and ended as an unresolved, eerie memory that continued to linger. A testament to the mysteries that sometimes we are never meant to fully understand. It was early fall 28 when my wife and I set out for our usual trip to Southwest Michigan. Our friends live in a remote area north of South Bend, Indiana, a place where the road turns to gravel and the trees seem to close in on you. By the time we made it to that secluded stretch of highway, it was pitch dark, and the fog rolled in like a heavy blanket. I'd driven this road countless times, but this night felt different. The road is a maze of blind turns and thick woods, and with the fog hugging the ground, visibility was minimal. We crept along, eyes scanning for deer that might dart out unexpectedly. The only sounds were the steady patter of rain against the windshield and the soft hum of the engine. The rain was persistent, creating a rhythm that felt oddly soothing, a kind of ambient soundscape against the tense atmosphere. As we rounded a particularly sharp bend, I caught a glimpse of something that made me second-guess my sanity. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing in the weeds, partially obscured by the tree line. He was dressed in a flannel shirt and overalls, but his lower body seemed to fade into the darkness. The figure was not fully solid, but rather had a ghostly, hazy white appearance. My heart skipped a beat, and the moment seemed to stretch on forever. I glanced at my wife, her face illuminated by the dashboard lights. Her eyes were wide, and I could see the same confusion and fear mirrored in her expression. The silence in the car was almost palpable. I turned to her, wanting to ask if she had seen what I did, but the look on her face told me she had. We both saw something that defied explanation. The rest of the drive was unsettling. Every time we passed that stretch of road, the air seemed to grow colder, and a tingly sensation crept over us. It felt as though the ghostly presence of the man in overalls had left an imprint on that stretch of road. The rain continued to fall, its soothing sound now intertwined with the eerie memory of that night, turning our typical drive into one of those true horror stories that you hear about, but never expect to experience yourself. The next morning, the fog had lifted, but the memory of the previous night clung to me like the mist. We had breakfast with our friends, trying to brush off the unsettling experience as just a trick of the light or a figment of our imagination. Yet, even as we laughed and talked, the image of the hazy figure lingered in my mind. It was one of those true scary stories that makes you question your sanity long after the event. Later, as we prepared to head back to Ohio, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The daylight provided no comfort, if anything. It made the previous night's encounter more surreal. My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances as we packed the car, both of us remembering the same ghostly vision. The road back was the same one that had frightened us before, and now the anticipation of the return trip was almost unbearable. We left our friend's house in the early afternoon, hoping that the daylight would dispel some of the lingering fear. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, casting a gray pallor over everything. As we approached the gravel drive that led to the main road, the sense of dread returned. The trees, though benign in the daylight, seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching out like dark fingers. As we drove, the familiar twists and turns of the road did nothing to ease our nerves. Each curve felt like a step deeper into the unknown. The fog had dissipated, but the unsettling feeling that had settled over us was still palpable. We drove slowly, scanning the roadside for any sign of the figure we had seen, but the road was deserted, and there was nothing but the sound of tires crunching over gravel and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. The eerie quiet of the road seemed almost too loud. It felt as though something was waiting in the darkness, just beyond the edge of our vision. The rain sounds had turned into a distant memory, replaced by a disquieting stillness. We were back on the same stretch of road where we had seen the ghostly figure, and the sensation of being in a scary tale from the night before was now a real and tangible fear. We both knew that this night had left an imprint on us, one we would never quite escape. We continued our drive, hoping that our rational minds would overcome the fear that had gripped us. The road, now familiar yet still ominous, seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Every shadow and every rustle in the underbrush took on a new significance. It was as if the road itself had become a character in our nighttime horror story, part of a true scary tale that refused to let us go. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the darkness began to encroach once again. We knew that soon we would be back at the place where the ghostly figure had appeared. The thought was unnerving. My wife and I remained silent, The only sound in the car was the soft hum of the engine and the occasional thump of raindrops against the windshield. It was a soundscape that had transformed from a sleep aid to a haunting reminder of our previous encounter. The gravel road felt different in the dark. It seemed to twist and turn more sharply, and the trees loomed larger, their branches swaying in the wind. The fog began to roll in again, thick and heavy, making it difficult to see even a few feet ahead. We drove cautiously, our eyes straining to catch any movement on the roadside. It was as though the night itself was conspiring to recreate the eerie conditions of the previous encounter. As we approached the spot where we had seen the figure, I felt my pulse quicken. The car slowed almost imperceptibly, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. I kept my gaze fixed on the darkened woods, half expecting to see the ghostly figure reappear. Every second felt stretched, as if time itself had slowed down. We passed the spot, and the tension in the car was palpable. The figure did not reappear, but the unsettling feeling remained. By the time we finally reached the end of the road and the safety of the highway, both my wife and I were visibly shaken. We exchanged a look that spoke volumes. The experience had left us both unnerved, as if we had ventured into one of those true horror stories where the line between reality and the supernatural blurred. The darkness of the road and the figure we had seen would forever be etched in our memories, a chilling reminder of the night when the familiar became frightening. The drive back to Ohio felt interminable. Even though the road was clear and the night was calm, the shadow of our earlier encounter lingered like a persistent chill. My wife and I tried to focus on the mundane aspects of the journey, switching on the radio, discussing our plans for the upcoming week, but the eerie memory was hard to shake. Every rustle of the trees or distant flash of headlights was a potential echo of the unsettling experience we'd had. The fog had lifted completely, and the rain had stopped, leaving a crisp, cool night in its wake. Despite this, we couldn't escape the uneasy sensation that had settled over us. It was as if the darkness of that remote road had seeped into the car, making the space between us feel colder and more isolating. The once soothing ambient soundscapes of rain now seemed like distant echoes from a nightmare. We talked briefly about our experience with our friends once we were back in Ohio. They listened with a mix of skepticism and curiosity, their expressions showing that they were intrigued but skeptical of our account. They offered no explanations or comfort, leaving us to grapple with the memory of the ghostly figure alone. The conversation did little to dispel the lingering fear that clung to us, like the damp chill of the fall night we had driven through. In the weeks that followed, every time we drove that route again, the tension would resurface. The area where we had seen the figure became a point of quiet reflection and dread. We never saw the ghostly man again, but the sensation of being watched, of having stepped into a scary story that defied explanation, remained a part of our drive. The memory became a chilling reminder of how quickly the familiar can turn into the frightening. Our encounter with the ghostly figure on that foggy, dark road became one of those true horror stories that we would recount with a shiver, not just because of the fear it inspired, but because of the inexplicable nature of the experience. The road, once a simple route to visit friends, had become a symbol of the supernatural and unsettling chapter in our lives that would haunt us every time we drove that way. And with that, we came to terms with our eerie encounter. The road, the figure, the sensation, it all became part of the fabric of our own personal horror story. A reminder that even the mundane can become a true scary tale under the right circumstances. I was heading into work early one morning, around 5:15 a.m. as usual. I lived in Red Wing, Minnesota, and commuted to Minneapolis. It was still dark outside, with the sun yet to rise. The sky was covered with low, puffy gray clouds that seemed to swallow any hint of dawn. The rain sounds from the previous night lingered in the air, a constant, soothing background to my drive. I had just settled into my routine, thinking about the day ahead, when something completely unexpected happened. Right in front of me, hovering just above the road, a silver disc appeared out of nowhere. It was exactly like something you'd read about in those horror stories or watch in a scary compilation. The disc had large, round windows with dark lines inside them, almost like oversized, ominous portholes. I could see at least 4 of these windows, each about 5 to 6 feet across. On top of the disc, there were smaller, asymmetrical circles, which only added to the unsettling appearance. The whole thing hovered right in front of me, and for a moment time seemed to freeze. I stared at the disc, completely stunned. My mouth was probably hanging open, and my heart was racing. The sight was so strange and out of place that I felt like I was in one of those nighttime stories that give you the chills. I had no idea what to make of it. Was this some kind of elaborate prank or a figment of my imagination? All I knew was that I couldn't tear my eyes away. It seemed like it was right there in my line of sight, dominating the whole road. The disc remained in view for about 10 seconds before it slowly rose back up into the clouds, disappearing from sight as suddenly as it had appeared. There was a pickup truck to my left and a small car behind me. I didn't even think to look at them, consumed entirely by my own shock. I was so overwhelmed that I wished I had some sort of camera, even a makeshift one, to capture the bizarre sight. But fumbling around for my cell phone would have been futile. By the time I found it, the disc would have vanished. Driving the rest of the way to work, my mind was still reeling from the encounter. The silver disc was the closest I had ever come to seeing a UFO, and the experience felt like it belonged in one of those scary tales meant to keep you awake at night. As I drove, I couldn't shake the image of the disc from my mind, and I wondered if I would ever find out if anyone else had seen it. For now, it was just another chapter in my personal collection of true stories that defy explanation. The encounter with the silver disc left me unsettled for the rest of the day. As I sat at my desk in Minneapolis, trying to focus on work, I kept replaying the scene over and over in my head. The disc had hovered silently, almost as if it was studying me. My thoughts kept drifting back to that moment on Highway 50, and the images of those eerie windows and asymmetrical circles haunted me like something out of a true horror story. The more I tried to concentrate, the more the event began to feel like a chilling narrative that belonged in a collection of scary stories. I couldn't share the experience with my coworkers. They would likely think I was exaggerating, or worse, losing my mind. So I kept it to myself, and the thought of it only deepened my sense of isolation. My entire day felt like a blur of routine, overshadowed by the unsettling memory of what I had seen. That night, I tried to shake off the unease by settling into my usual bedtime routine. I put on a relaxing horror soundtrack to help me sleep, hoping the ambient soundscapes would calm my nerves. The rain sounds from the previous night had stopped, leaving behind a stillness that felt oddly oppressive. The vivid images of the disc that had taken residence in my mind. As I lay in bed, I tried to relax, but the experience from that morning was too fresh. I found myself drifting between wakefulness and sleep, plagued by thoughts of the disc. Was it a figment of my imagination, or had I truly seen something extraordinary? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like a narrative from a scary compilation, a story that blends reality with the realm of the uncanny. Eventually, exhaustion won over my anxiety, and I managed to drift into a restless sleep. Yet, even in dreams, the disc seemed to follow me, casting an eerie shadow over my nighttime stories. It was as if the disc had become an unwelcome part of my psyche, transforming a normal day into something that felt like it belonged in a scary tale meant to chill the bones. The next morning, I was still shaken from the events of the previous day. I drove the same route to work, hoping that perhaps the sighting had been a mere fluke or a trick of the light. However, as I neared Highway 50 again, the anxiety from the previous day came rushing back. I was desperate for some normalcy, something to remind me that life hadn't turned into a sequence of dark, unsettling narratives. As I passed the spot where the disc had appeared, I saw a truck pulled over on the side of the road with its hazard lights flashing. Curious, I slowed down and saw the driver standing outside, looking around with an expression of confusion. I pulled over, hoping that this person might have seen something that could explain my experience. "Everything okay?" I asked as I approached. The driver, a middle-aged man with a tired face, looked at me with a mixture of relief and skepticism. "You won't believe this," he said. "I saw something strange last night. A disc, just like what you described. It was right above the road, and then it just vanished." My heart skipped a beat. "You saw it too?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. It was reassuring yet terrifying to hear that someone else had witnessed the same thing. "Did you manage to get a picture or anything?" He shook his head. "No, I didn't think to take a picture. I was just too stunned. I've been trying to make sense of it all morning." We exchanged stories, and it became clear that his experience mirrored mine almost perfectly. It was eerie to realize that this wasn't just a hallucination or a figment of my imagination. Hearing his account was like reading a chapter from a scary story that had come to life. The validation was comforting, yet the fact that two of us had witnessed such an anomaly only added to the sense of unease. As we parted ways, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. At least I wasn't alone in this experience. But the encounter left a lasting impression on me. It felt like something out of those true stories and scary tales meant to haunt you. The rain sounds from the previous night seemed to return, amplifying the lingering discomfort. The rest of the week passed in a blur, overshadowed by the haunting image of the disc and the unsettling confirmation from the driver. I tried to resume my daily routine, but the encounter had left a permanent mark on my sense of reality. Each drive on Highway 50 felt like stepping into a narrative from one of those nighttime stories that play on the edge of fear and curiosity. On Friday night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unresolved. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a detour to the location where I'd seen the disc. I drove slowly, hoping to find anything that might shed light on the strange event. The area was quiet, and the only sound was the ambient soundscapes of the night, punctuated by distant rain sounds. As I reached the spot, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the side of the road, was a series of unusual markings on the pavement. They were strange and asymmetrical, like distorted circles and lines, reminiscent of the disc's windows. I pulled over and examined them more closely, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The markings seemed almost deliberately placed, as if someone or something had been trying to communicate or leave a sign. I snapped a few photos with my phone, though I doubted they would reveal much. The eerie feeling in the air was palpable, almost as if the environment itself was part of a larger, unsettling narrative. I couldn't shake the thought that this was some sort of message, or part of a story that was still unfolding. Driving back home, I couldn't help but reflect on how my once ordinary commute had turned into a chapter from a true horror story. The experience, coupled with the strange markings, made me question what I had witnessed. It felt like a dark environment had transformed a routine drive into a chilling tale meant for bedtime stories that keep you awake. As the days passed, the memory of that encounter lingered like a shadow. The disc, the strange markings, and the eerie validation from the other witness had turned what was meant to be a simple drive into an unsettling experience I'd never forget. It was a reminder of how the ordinary can suddenly become extraordinary, and how sometimes the scariest stories are the ones we live to tell. And with that, the story of the mysterious disc on Highway 50 came to an end, leaving behind more questions than answers, and a lingering sense of awe and fear. It was the kind of night that felt like it was waiting for something to happen. The rain pounded against the windshield of the truck, creating a rhythmic symphony that would have been soothing if it weren't for the creeping unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. I had been driving down Highway 17, heading towards Denver, a route I had taken countless times before. My partner was fast asleep in the passenger seat, oblivious to the unsettling aura that seemed to grow thicker with every mile. The night was pitch black, with only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the landscape in eerie snapshots. It was one of those nights when the rain's sounds turned from a mere backdrop into a constant, oppressive presence. I had always found solace in the routine of my drives, the steady hum of the engine a comforting reminder of normalcy. But tonight, something felt different. As we approached F Road 1,000 feet or so in the air, I noticed a dark shape moving across the sky. It wasn't moving fast, and the lights encircling it, green, amber, and white, seemed to drift almost lazily. My first thought was that it could be a drone, but it was far too large for that. There was no noise, nothing to suggest that it was anything but an anomaly. I rolled down the window, straining to catch any sound, but the silence outside was absolute. I tried to point it out to my partner, but he simply muttered something unintelligible and turned away, still deep in sleep. The object continued its slow journey across the sky, eventually disappearing into the darkness. I felt a strange chill, as if the rain and shadows had conspired to trap me in a moment of heightened awareness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong, but I had no evidence, no tangible sign of what was causing my discomfort. The truck's interior felt suddenly claustrophobic. The shadows cast by the dashboard light seemed to writhe and dance, adding to the eerie ambiance. I tried to dismiss it as a trick of my tired mind, but as the miles ticked away, the tension remained. The calm, rational explanations I tried to conjure up did nothing to soothe the growing dread. It was as if the darkness outside had seeped into the very core of my being. The rain continued its relentless assault as I drove, the wipers struggling to keep up with the deluge. The road stretched out before me, a seemingly endless ribbon of asphalt that twisted and turned through the darkness. My eyes kept drifting to the clock on the dashboard, noting the passing time with increasing concern. It felt like we had been driving for hours, but the clock told a different story. Time seemed to have warped in a way I couldn't quite understand. The silence in the truck was occasionally broken by the low rumble of thunder, each clap echoing off the mountains that loomed on either side of us. I glanced at my partner, still sound asleep, and felt a pang of frustration. I needed to talk to someone about the strange encounter earlier, but he was completely out of it. The sense of isolation was palpable, and the rain sounds outside only amplified it. As I drove on, the rain began to ease, though the darkness remained impenetrable. I saw a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision and turned my head quickly, but there was nothing there. The sensation of being watched returned, more intense than before. My heart pounded a little harder, and I tried to focus on the road, willing myself to push through the creeping anxiety. The truck's interior seemed to have taken on a life of its own, the shadows growing deeper and more menacing. The ambient soundscapes of the rain and thunder were punctuated by unsettling creaks and groans from the truck itself. I started to feel a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration in the seat, like something was trying to get my attention. I couldn't pinpoint its source, but it made me increasingly uneasy. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping that a brief pause would help me clear my mind. The truck's engine fell silent, replaced by the quiet hiss of rain on the pavement. I sat there for a moment, gathering my thoughts, trying to rationalize the odd feeling that had settled over me. But as I looked out into the dark, rain-soaked landscape, I couldn't shake the sense that something was very wrong. The rain continued, a soothing yet unsettling backdrop to my growing unease. With a deep breath, I restarted the truck and resumed our journey. The rain had lessened, but the darkness seemed thicker than before. The road ahead was barely visible, shrouded in a fog that seemed to have rolled in from nowhere. The headlights cut through the mist, revealing just enough of the road to keep us moving, but the sense of unease remained palpable. As I drove, my mind kept drifting back to the strange object I had seen earlier. I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of the shadows and rain, but the feeling of something being wrong persisted. The silence inside the truck was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. The sound was both comforting and unnerving, a reminder of the storm that still raged outside. My eyes were drawn to the rearview mirror more often than I liked. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of something in the distance, but it would vanish as quickly as it appeared. I told myself it was just the play of headlights and rain, but a part of me remained unconvinced. The thought that something might be following us, or that I was simply imagining it all, gnawed at me. The rain had tapered off to a light drizzle, and the fog was beginning to lift slightly, yet the atmosphere remained thick with a sense of foreboding. I could see the faint outline of a small diner up ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly in the night. It seemed like a good place to stop and regroup, to clear my mind and possibly find some answers. I pulled into the diner's parking lot, the truck's tires crunching on the gravel as I came to a halt. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow on the empty lot. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the ambient soundscapes of the rain and distant thunder. My mind was a whirl of conflicting thoughts and feelings, and I hoped that stepping inside might offer some respite from the unsettling events of the night. The diner's interior was dimly lit, with a few scattered tables and a long counter. The smell of stale coffee and greasy food hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of rain. I slid into a booth and tried to shake off the lingering anxiety that had accompanied me throughout the drive. The waitress, an older woman with a tired smile, brought me a cup of coffee and left me to my thoughts. Sipping the coffee, I stared out the window, watching as the rain continued its steady patter on the glass. The flickering neon sign outside cast odd shadows on the walls, creating a dance of light and dark that felt almost hypnotic. I replayed the events of the night in my mind, trying to piece together what I had seen and felt. As I sat there, a feeling of clarity began to emerge. The strange object, the shadows, and the eerie vibrations in the truck, all of it seemed to be connected by a thread of psychological tension rather than something supernatural. The rain sounds and the darkness had combined to create a heightened sense of fear and uncertainty. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that my mind had played tricks on me during the long, solitary drive. I finished my coffee, feeling a bit more grounded. The night had not revealed any concrete answers, but it had forced me to confront my own fears and uncertainties. I realized that the sense of dread was a product of my own mind, amplified by the isolated and dark environment. The truck, the rain, and the shadows were all part of a narrative my mind had woven in response to the stress of the journey. With a deep breath, I left the diner and headed back to the truck. The rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was beginning to pierce through the darkness. The road ahead was clear, and as I drove away from the diner, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The night's events had been unsettling, but they had also been a reminder of the power of the mind to create its own horrors. Sometimes the scariest tales are the ones we tell ourselves. The drive to Denver continued uneventfully, and as the sun rose, the fears of the night seemed to fade with the darkness. The journey had been a test of perception, a reminder that sometimes the most frightening stories are the ones we create in our own minds. It was one of those nights where everything seemed ordinary, right until it wasn't. I had been dating my wife for just a few months, and things were going well. That night, we decided to go on a casual date. She lived on the outskirts of Toronto, where the suburbs met the quiet countryside. It was one of those places where you could still see the stars clearly in the night sky, not yet drowned out by the city lights. We found ourselves parked behind a quiet school, just sitting in the car, enjoying the calm in each other's company. Little did we know that this night would turn into one of those true horror stories, the kind you only hear in scary tales passed down over time. As we sat there talking and laughing, she suddenly grew quiet. Her eyes kept darting over my shoulder, out the window behind me. At first I thought nothing of it, but then she said, "There's a weird light over there." I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, there it was, a bright, stationary light hanging in the sky, just far enough away to be unsettling. It wasn't a plane, or at least, it didn't move like one. It hung between two apartment buildings, far off in the distance. It was strange, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was probably just a streetlight or something equally mundane. But she knew the area better than I did, and she wasn't convinced. She kept staring at it, her unease growing by the minute. 20 minutes passed, and the light hadn't moved, or so I thought. My wife, however, was convinced it had shifted slightly. It wasn't in that spot before. She insisted. I tried to reassure her, but the longer we sat there, the more it started to mess with my head too. I glanced at it again, and sure enough, it seemed to have moved a little lower and to the right. The thing about horror stories is that they don't start with big, dramatic moments. They start with something small, something you could almost ignore if it weren't so out of place. That's how this felt, just a little off, but enough to put a pit in my stomach. We decided to get out of the car, thinking maybe we were overreacting. But the second we stepped out and closed the door, the light started to move, not just a little, but fast, straight toward us. My heart skipped a beat as we stood there, frozen. The light wasn't just some far-off street light or star, it was coming directly at us. Silent and eerie, like something out of one of those scary stories you hear but never really believe. It was too close for comfort. And yet there was no sound, no wind, nothing but that glowing, menacing light. As it got closer, we could see that it wasn't just light, it had a shape. An oval-like form that seemed to be made entirely of this strange orange-yellow glow. No wings, no rotors, just light. And it moved with an unnatural speed, cutting across the sky horizontally as if it had a mind of its own. For a moment, we were completely frozen, just watching this thing defy all logic. Then, just as quickly as it had come toward us, it stopped. It hung there, motionless once again, as if it was observing us. But before we could even react, it blinked a few times and shot off into the night, disappearing into the dark sky. To this day, I still don't know what we saw. It wasn't a plane or a helicopter or anything else I could explain. It was just there, and then it wasn't. Every time I tell this story, I am reminded of how fragile our understanding of the world really is. My wife hates when I bring it up. She thinks people will think we're crazy, but I know what we saw, and I know that sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones that come with explanations. They're the ones that leave you with nothing but questions and a lingering sense of unease. As soon as that light disappeared, the silence that followed was almost deafening. We stood there not knowing what to do. The air felt thick, like the night itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My wife, usually so composed, was visibly shaken. She clung to my arm, her eyes scanning the sky as if she expected the light to reappear any second. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient soundscape of the night. I nodded, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, as if moving would somehow make this situation even more real. The thing about scary tales is that they never prepare you for the quiet moments that follow the horror. The silence becomes its own kind of terror. As we got back into the car, the sound of the engine starting felt almost too loud, breaking the eerie stillness of the night. We drove away, but the unease lingered like a shadow in the back seat. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting that light to be following us. But the road behind was just as empty as it had been before. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. We tried to talk about anything else, something to distract ourselves, but the fear was still there, gnawing at the edges of our thoughts. Every noise seemed to amplify the rain sounds against the windshield, the hum of the tires on the pavement. Even the soft patter of raindrops felt menacing. I remember thinking how bizarre it was that something as simple as rain, which is usually calming, now felt like part of a horror soundtrack. The night had turned against us, and there was no escaping that creeping feeling that we weren't alone. As we drove deeper into the suburban landscape, I couldn't shake the feeling that the light was still out there, watching us. My wife must have felt the same, because she kept glancing nervously out the windows, her breath coming in short, anxious bursts. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt it too, that sense that the light wasn't just some random event, but something deliberate, something that had noticed us. The more I thought about it, the more the fear became a physical thing, tightening in my chest like a vice. We finally pulled up to her house, the familiar sight of her front porch offering a brief sense of relief. But as we sat there in the driveway, neither of us made a move to get out. The night, once so peaceful, now seemed like a dark environment that hid unseen dangers. We sat in silence, just listening to the rain. The kind of silence that stretches on forever when you're too afraid to speak. Eventually, she broke the stillness. "Do you think it's still out there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was how this was supposed to be a normal night, just another evening spent together, but now it had become something we'd never forget. I shrugged, trying to play it off, but the truth was, I didn't know, and that uncertainty was scarier than anything else. We stayed in the car for a long time, too afraid to step into the open, too afraid to admit that whatever had happened wasn't over yet. After what felt like an eternity, we finally worked up the courage to get out of the car. The moment we stepped outside, the rain seemed colder, sharper, like tiny needles against our skin. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the driveway. I reached for her hand and we hurried to the front door, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up our spines. As soon as we were inside, I locked the door behind us, the click of the deadbolt providing a small sense of security that I knew was only an illusion. We didn't talk much as we moved through the house. The usual routine of getting settled felt strange and hollow, like we were just going through the motions. She turned on the TV, hoping to drown out the quiet with some familiar noise. But even the sound of the evening news couldn't erase the feeling that something was still out there. We both kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see that light hovering outside. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that whatever it was over now. But deep down, I knew better. Later, when we finally went to bed, the tension in the air hadn't eased. The rain sounds, once soothing, now felt ominous, like a backdrop to a dark narrative that wasn't finished yet. She fell asleep eventually, but I couldn't. My mind kept replaying the events of the night, over and over, like a horror story on repeat. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but the memory of that light wouldn't leave me alone. At some point I decided to get up. Lying there in the dark, surrounded by the ambient soundscape of the night, was driving me crazy. I wandered into the living room, hoping that a drink or some late-night TV might help me relax. But as I reached for the remote, I glanced out the window, and my heart stopped. There, hovering just beyond the edge of the yard, was the light. It was back, and it was closer than ever before. Panic set in immediately. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The light was just there, silent and unblinking, like it had been waiting for me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to wake her up and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It was as if the light had locked onto me, like it was staring right through me. My hands shook as I reached for the curtain, yanking it closed as if that thin piece of fabric could protect us from whatever was out there. I stood frozen by the window, the curtain clenched tightly in my fist. My mind raced with fear, confusion, and the unnerving realization that whatever this thing was, it wasn't going away. I didn't know what it wanted, and that made it worse. Every logical explanation I had tried to convince myself of earlier, the streetlight, the helicopter, the plane, seemed laughable now. This was something else, something beyond my understanding, and it was here, just a few feet away. For what felt like an eternity, I didn't move. I just listened to the rain sounds tapping against the window, to the eerie quiet of the night, to the pounding of my own heartbeat. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light started to drift away. It didn't blink out or speed off into the distance this time. It just floated slowly, almost lazily, back into the darkness, like it had decided that whatever it had come for, it was finished now. I watched it go, my breath returning in shallow gasps. Relief washed over me, but it was a fragile kind of relief, the kind that left more questions than answers. I stumbled back to the couch and sat down, trying to process what had just happened. The light was gone, but the unsettling feeling lingered. I kept thinking about the way it had moved, the way it had hovered so close to us without making a sound. Nothing about this night made any sense. These weren't just stories you hear in passing or scary tales told to freak you out before bed. This was real, and it had just happened to us. Sleep was out of the question, so I sat there in the dark, staring at the TV screen that I hadn't even bothered to turn on. My thoughts were a mess, jumping from one thing to the next. What was that light? Why had it followed us? And what would have happened if we hadn't gone inside when we did? The fear of the unknown hung in the air like an invisible fog, thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the idea that maybe this wasn't the end, that maybe, somehow, it wasn't over. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I was exhausted. She woke up a few hours later, oblivious to the fact that I hadn't slept. I didn't tell her that the light had come back. There was no point. She was already shaken by what we had seen, and I didn't want to make it worse. We went through our morning routine in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. But the memory of that night, the light, the way it moved, the cold dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach stayed with me. Even now, years later, it hasn't left. I've heard plenty of horror stories in my life. True stories, scary stories, tales meant to chill your bones and keep you awake at night. But nothing compares to what happened that night. It was real, and it changed something in me. Now, whenever I hear rain sounds or relaxing horror compilations, I can't help but think of that night, of the light in the sky that defied explanation. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what we saw, but one thing's for sure. It's a night I'll never forget. You ever hear those stories? The ones that seem too bizarre to be true? The kind you dismiss as nonsense if someone told them over a campfire? Well, I've got one for you, a true story that happened when I was just a kid, riding shotgun with my dad, an OTR trucker. It's the kind of scary story that sticks with you, especially when it all goes down in a place as eerie as the mountains of Slovakia. Trust me, this is no bedtime story to lull you to sleep. If you're looking for relaxing horror, you've come to the wrong place. We were heading home, driving through a mountain pass late at night. The rain was coming down hard, and the sound of it hitting the cab was like white noise, almost a sleep aid on any other night. But that night, the rain sounds only added to the dark environment. I remember the steady hum of the truck's engine, the windshield wipers working overtime, and the way the headlights barely cut through the misty air. It was just us and the road, or so I thought. The truck was really struggling uphill. My dad, who knew that Volvo FH12 inside and out, started muttering under his breath. We weren't making much progress, and something felt off. We should have been cruising down those slopes, but instead we could barely hit 60 kph. Dad pulled over at a small lay-by to check the brakes, thinking maybe they were sticking. He'll never forget the way he stepped out into the rain, checking each wheel in the dim glow of his flashlight. A few brakes were hot, but nothing unusual for driving in the hills. He climbed back into the cab, drenched, shaking his head. We sat in silence for a minute, listening to the rain and the faint groan of the truck. Then, as Dad released the parking brake, something happened that still haunts me. Our fully loaded semi started rolling backward, uphill. And not just a slight incline, this was a steep mountain road. And we were being pulled up it like there was some invisible force dragging us along. Neither of us spoke at first. What do you say when the impossible is happening right in front of you? Dad tried putting the truck in gear, but nothing. He even killed the engine, and still we rolled backward, inch by inch, up the hill. It wasn't fast, but it was steady, like whatever was pulling us had all the time in the world. We must have traveled a good 3 or 4 miles like that. It wasn't until we hit a flat stretch of road that the force seemed to let go, and the truck finally stopped. The rain continued to pound against the windshield, but inside that cab, everything was silent. Too silent. We didn't talk about it for the rest of the drive. What was there to say? Later, when Dad mentioned it to other truckers, they just laughed it off. Said we must have been confused about which way the hill was sloping, but we weren't. We knew what happened that night. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever come across another story like ours, a true trucker horror story that defies explanation. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never forget those 3 miles of terror. After that night, things were never quite the same when we hit the road. You'd think we'd just shrug it off as some weird fluke of the universe, but it stuck with us. Every time we passed through mountain roads or faced bad weather, I could see the tension in my dad's grip on the steering wheel. It was like we were always waiting for something else to happen. And as fate would have it, it did. Another true story. Another long haul, this time somewhere deep in Poland. And again, the rain was pouring down. The kind of rain that turns everything into shadows and reflections. We were on a narrow road, cutting through dense woods, the kind that swallow your headlights. The rain sounds had become a familiar soundtrack, soothing almost. But that night it felt different, more like a warning than a sleep aid. The road was empty. Not another car or truck in sight, just us and the dark environment. We were making decent time despite the weather though, and I remember thinking that maybe this trip would be uneventful for once. But as we rounded a bend, I saw them lights, dim and flickering, ahead of us in the distance. At first they looked like taillights from another vehicle, but something was off. They were too low to the ground and moving too slowly. I mentioned it to Dad, who just nodded, his eyes narrowing in the rain-soaked windshield. He flashed the high beams, but there was no response. The lights didn't speed up, didn't change direction. They just kept floating there, bobbing slightly like they were attached to something swaying in the wind. Dad eased off the gas, trying to get a better look, but the closer we got, the more unsettling the lights became. Suddenly, the lights split apart, like two fireflies drifting in opposite directions. One veered left, disappearing into the trees, and the other drifted right, swallowed by the shadows. Dad slammed on the brakes, and we both sat there staring into the dark. There was nothing ahead of us. No vehicle, no person, just the rain and the woods. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the sound of the rain growing louder in the silence. Then, as if to break the tension, Dad muttered something about wildlife and kept driving, but I wasn't convinced. Those lights, they didn't move like animals. They moved with purpose. As we continued down that lonely road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I know I said not to focus on that, but the sensation was there, pressing against the back of my mind. The lights never reappeared, but the tension in the cab was thick. I tried to relax, to let the familiar sounds of the rain and the hum of the engine lull me into that half-awake state that's common on long trips, but it wasn't happening. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those floating lights, dancing just out of reach. It wasn't until we reached a small town hours later that the feeling began to fade. We pulled into a rest area, the lights of the gas station casting a warm glow over the wet pavement. I remember feeling relieved, like we'd just come through something dangerous and made it out the other side, but the memory of those lights stayed with me. A scary tale I didn't share with anyone. Maybe it was just my imagination, the rain playing tricks on my eyes. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something more to it, a story that could easily join the ranks of true horror stories passed around by truckers on lonely nights. You'd think after seeing those lights we'd be done with strange happenings on the road, but trucking isn't like that. Every haul has its own challenges, and sometimes those challenges come from things you can't quite explain. This next story happened a couple of months later, this time in Lithuania. The night was calm, no rain sounds to mask the dark environment, just the steady hum of the truck and the occasional rustle of wind against the cab. My dad and I had been on the road for hours, working our way through the countryside, where the towns were few and far between. It was late, and we were both tired, the kind of tired that makes everything seem a little blurry around the edges. Dad was focused on the road, hands gripping the wheel, and I was staring out the window, watching the trees blur past in the dim glow of the headlights. That's when I saw it, a shape, dark and shadowy, sitting on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just another roadside marker, or maybe a tree stump, but as we got closer, it started to move. It stood up, tall and thin, and before I could say anything, it stepped right into our path. Dad swerved, barely avoiding it, and for a split second, I saw its face pale, almost glowing in the dark, but just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the night. Dad didn't stop, didn't even look at me. He just kept driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I could tell he saw it too, but he wasn't about to acknowledge it. Not out loud, anyway. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes before he finally spoke. His voice low and steady. Probably just a deer, he said, but we both knew better. Deer don't walk on two legs, and they sure as hell don't have faces like that. As we drove on, the air in the cab grew heavy, like something was pressing down on us. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see that figure again, but there was nothing. just the endless stretch of road and the dark shapes of trees lining the sides. We passed through a small village, its lights barely visible in the distance, and for a moment I felt a little safer, like maybe we'd left whatever that thing was behind. But as we cleared the village, the feeling came back stronger this time. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like we weren't alone in the truck anymore. I could sense something, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows behind us. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the road ahead, but the more I tried, the more aware I became of it. The sound of the engine, the steady rhythm of the tires on the asphalt, even the slight creak of the cab, it all seemed wrong. Like there was an extra sound mixed in. Something I couldn't quite place. We didn't stop until we reached the next rest area. And when we did, Dad was out of the truck faster than I'd ever seen him move. He didn't say anything, just started checking the back of the cab, the trailer, everything. I stayed in the truck, too scared to move, listening to the night sounds and wondering what the hell had just happened. When Dad finally climbed back into the cab, he was pale, his eyes darker than usual. He didn't say what he was looking for, and I didn't ask. But I knew, deep down, that he didn't find it. Whatever it was, it had been with us. And now, it was gone. Another horror story to add to our collection. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a mix of fatigue and paranoia. But the way Dad looked that night, I knew it wasn't just me. These scary stories, these true stories, they stay with you. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself glancing into the shadows, wondering if that unseen passenger is still out there, waiting for another long-haul truck to pass by in the night. We thought we had seen it all, the strange lights in Poland, the pale figure in Lithuania, the invisible force in Slovakia, but nothing prepared us for what happened next. This time we were driving through Romania, a place that has its fair share of scary tales. It was late, sometime past midnight, and the road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the Carpathian Mountains. There was no rain this time, just the steady sound of the engine and the wind whistling through the trees. The road was narrow, with steep drops on either side, and we were careful to keep our speed in check. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the fog began to roll in, thick and heavy, like a blanket covering the world. It wasn't unusual for these parts, but this fog felt different. It clung to the truck, swirling around us as if it had a mind of its own. The headlights barely cut through it, and the road ahead became little more than a ghostly outline. Dad slowed down, his eyes darting from the road to the mirrors, trying to make sense of the thick mist that seemed to be closing in on us. That's when I saw it, a shadow in the fog, moving alongside the truck. At first, I thought it was just the play of light and mist, but then it happened again. This time on the other side, the shadows moved with us, keeping pace, just out of reach of the headlights. I didn't say anything at first, thinking maybe it was just my imagination. But then Dad spoke up, his voice tight with unease. "You see that?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to say. The shadows weren't solid, more like impressions, but they were definitely there, shifting and blending into the fog. We kept driving, the fog growing thicker by the minute, and the shadows never left our side. It was as if we were being followed, or worse, surrounded by something we couldn't quite see. The road seemed endless, the turns sharper, the drops steeper. It felt like we had been driving for hours, but the GPS still showed the same stretch of road, as if we weren't moving at all. Dad was gripping the wheel so hard his knuckles were white, his jaw clenched. I could tell he was trying to stay calm, but the tension in the cab was palpable. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It hadn't changed in over an hour. That's when I realized something was very wrong. We should have reached the next town by now, or at least seen some sign of civilization. But there was nothing. Just the fog, the shadows, and the endless road. We drove on in silence, the dark environment pressing in on us. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of something in the fog, a face, maybe, or a hand reaching out. But every time I blinked, it was gone, leaving only the swirling mist. Dad didn't say anything, but I could tell he was seeing it too. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the fog began to thin, and the road straightened out, We passed a sign for a town, one we hadn't seen on the GPS, and Dad let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. We pulled into a small, rundown rest stop on the outskirts of the town, the lights flickering in the early morning haze. Dad parked the truck, and we both sat there for a moment, neither of us moving. The fog was still hanging in the air, but the shadows were gone. I didn't know what to say, and neither did he. We had just spent hours on a road that seemed to defy time and space, and now we were here, in a place that didn't even seem real. When we finally got out of the truck, everything felt off. The air was too still, the town too quiet. It was like we had stepped into another world, one that wasn't meant for us. Dad didn't waste any time. He checked the truck, refueled, and we were back on the road before the sun had a chance to rise. We didn't talk about what happened, not then, not ever. It was just another one of those scary compilations of experiences that you bury deep down, hoping they won't resurface. Years later, when people ask about my time on the road, I tell them the usual trucker stories, the long nights, the endless highways, the strange things you see out there. But I never tell them about that night in Romania. Some horror stories are better left untold, locked away in the back of your mind. After all, who would believe us? True stories like these sleep horror, nighttime stories, they don't fit into the usual narrative. They linger in the dark, in the places we can't explain, and sometimes it's better to let them stay there. The night was settling in as I drove through the remote stretches of highway in southwest Michigan. I'd been hauling cargo for years, but tonight felt different. The clouds overhead thickened, cloaking the road in a thick blanket of darkness. Rain began to pelt against the windshield, creating a rhythmic drumming sound that was oddly soothing. It's the kind of sound that can either help you relax or set your nerves on edge, depending on your mood. I was trucking alone tonight, a rare occurrence for me. My usual route was well known, and I had driven this stretch countless times. The night was quiet, too quiet. The rain muffled all the usual nighttime noises, leaving just the sound of the tires splashing through puddles. It was like driving through a world that had paused. I reached for the radio, but static crackled through the speakers and I decided against it. Sometimes the absence of sound is more unsettling than its presence. It was during these quiet moments that the mind starts to wander. I thought about all the trips I'd taken over the years, the countless miles on the road. My thoughts drifted to past experiences, the strange lights in the sky, the eerie sense of being observed. None of it had ever really bothered me before. But tonight, the solitude made those memories resurface. The feeling of being alone in the dark seemed to amplify the shadows cast by my own thoughts. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw something in the distance that made me hit the brakes. A shadowy figure stood at the edge of the road, partially obscured by the rain. I couldn't make out details clearly, but the outline seemed human. I pulled over, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I was alone, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if waiting. The rain fell harder, and the figure remained motionless. I hesitated, feeling a chill creep down my spine. I glanced at the clock, only a few hours until dawn. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I sat there, staring at the shadow, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of dread. Was it just a trick of the light and rain, or was there something more sinister about this night? The shadowy figure had disappeared by the time I gathered the courage to get out of the truck. My heart was still racing as I checked around the area, but there was nothing to be found, just the relentless rain and the dark, empty road. I climbed back into the cab, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The radio still crackled with static, adding to the sense of isolation. As I resumed driving, I couldn't get the figure out of my mind. I tried to focus on the road, but the sense of foreboding was overwhelming. The miles seemed to stretch endlessly. I glanced at the clock again. An hour had passed since I last checked, but it felt like only minutes. My head was swimming with the disconcerting thought of lost time. The rain continued to pound against the windshield, blending with the monotonous hum of the engine. My eyelids felt heavy, and despite my attempts to stay alert, I found myself struggling to keep focused. It was as if the road itself was conspiring to lull me into a state of unease. I reached for a coffee cup from the truck's cup holder, hoping the caffeine would help, but the warm liquid offered little comfort. Suddenly I felt a jolt as the truck seemed to hit a bump, except there was nothing on the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt as I looked around, my pulse racing. The shadows around me seemed to move in a way that made my skin crawl. The rain still fell, but now it felt like it was intensifying, the droplets hammering down with a more urgent rhythm. My mind was in overdrive as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Could the truck have been on an uneven surface? Or was my exhaustion playing tricks on me? The idea of being watched or followed flitted through my mind, but I pushed it away. I couldn't afford to let fear get the best of me. Not while I was out here alone on the road. The rain eased up slightly, and I continued driving, trying to push the unsettling experiences to the back of my mind. The road ahead was a narrow ribbon of asphalt, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in on me as I drove. The trees, silhouetted against the night sky, created an almost claustrophobic feeling, enhancing the darkness around me. As I drove, I noticed faint lights flickering in the distance, seemingly floating in the trees. I tried to convince myself they were just reflections or car lights from another road, but there was something unnervingly erratic about their movement. They darted and danced, disappearing as quickly as they appeared. I squinted through the windshield, trying to get a better look, but they remained elusive. The atmosphere inside the truck felt thick with tension. I reached for the radio again, hoping for some distraction, but it remained a static-filled void. The lights in the woods seemed to pulse in time with the drumming rain, creating a surreal, almost hypnotic effect. I was torn between curiosity and fear, unable to decide whether to investigate or simply drive on. Just then, the lights seemed to converge into a single bright spot. I slowed the truck, my mind racing as I approached the location where the lights had been most intense. There was no sign of anything unusual, just the road and the darkened forest surrounding it. I pulled over and stepped out of the truck, rain soaking through my jacket as I scanned the area. The lights had vanished, leaving only the steady rain and the oppressive silence. A sudden, sharp gust of wind howled through the trees, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I had no choice but to get back on the road. The unsettling experience left me feeling more isolated than ever. As I resumed my drive, I glanced at the clock again. Time had slipped away in a way I couldn't explain. The journey seemed endless, and the sense of dread refused to lift. The hours dragged on as I drove through the eerie, rain-soaked night. My mind was a jumbled mess of fear and confusion, unable to reconcile the strange lights and the inexplicable loss of time. I clung to the hope that dawn would bring clarity and an end to the unsettling events of the night. As the first light of morning began to pierce through the dark clouds, the road ahead slowly became visible. The oppressive darkness lifted, but the strange feeling lingered. I was relieved to see the sun, even if it was just a weak and overcast light filtering through the clouds. I focused on the road, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease. I finally arrived at my destination as the sun fully rose, the cargo unloaded, and the usual bustle of activity helped me regain a sense of normalcy. The workers around me chatted and joked, oblivious to the night's horrors that I had experienced. I was grateful for the company, even if it was just for a brief respite from the isolation of the night. As I reflected on the night's events, I realized that I had no concrete answers, only unsettling memories and vague impressions of what had occurred. The phantom lights, the sense of lost time, and the shadowy figure by the road remained mysteries. I wondered if the night had been a product of my exhaustion and stress, or if there was something more to it. With the day's work done, I headed back to my truck, ready to drive home. Despite the strange occurrences, the road seemed less menacing, and the daylight. I hoped that the night's events would remain just a haunting memory, a strange chapter in the book of my trucking life. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night had left its mark, a reminder of how the ordinary can turn unsettling in the blink of an eye. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.